There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition. It lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Dimensions, a Twilight Zone podcast. In tonight's episode, we will be discussing Season 1, Episode 15, titled, I Shot an Arrow into the Air. It was written by Rod Serling, based on a story idea by Madeline Champion, which we will get to later. It was directed by Stuart Rosenberg or Alan Smithy, depending, and we will also touch on that later in the trivia section of the podcast. Music by Bernard Herrmann, and in the cast were Dewey Martin, Edward Binns, and Ted Otis. You can watch this episode on MeTV if you're, quick enough to, if it happens to be on when you want to watch it. It's on demand on Pluto TV. And then, of course, if you have the DVDs or Blu-rays, you can always watch it then at your leisure. It first aired on January 15th, 1960. And beware ahead, there are spoilers and trivia and goofs and everything else and anything else you could want in an episode of this podcast. So beware, if you haven't seen it, turn off the episode now, go watch it, come back and finish out the podcast. And then write me an email at dimensionszpodcast@gmail.com and let me know your thoughts about this episode or next week's episode. I look forward to any feedback you guys have. So if you're listening and you want to say something, feel free to email me. I love getting feedback. So, in the absence of my good friend Will Lastly, here is myself with this episode's opening narration. Take it away, me. Her name is the Arrow One. She represents 4.5 years of planning, preparation, and training, and 1,000 years of science, mathematics, and the projected dreams and hopes of not only a nation, but a world. She is the first manned aircraft into space, and this is the countdown. The last 5 seconds before man shot an arrow into the air. So we start out with some stock rocket launch footage and learn that a crew of 8 astronauts take off from Earth as the first manned aircraft into space. The craft gets lost in flight and trajectory from mission control and crash lands on what is believed to be an asteroid. 4 of the 8 survive, and those 4 are Commander Donlin, Corey, Pearson, and Hudak. The commanding officer, Donlin, when we see him, is using his captain's log as sort of a narration / expository sort of info dump on the audience as far as what happened and how it happened and where they are and how they are. And we learned that they are on an asteroid. It is a very hot and unforgiving area in which they are currently lost. Ship is obliterated, supplies are low, and the morale of what's left of the crew is in tatters. Hudak is going to die. He is not doing well. So the commanding officer, Donlin, tries to settle everyone down. Corey, I believe he was the navigator, is very every man for themselves sort of, attitude at this point. But Donlin is able to keep everyone together, and they work together to bury the dead, the 4 crewmen that didn't survive. So they bury the dead. Everyone's hot and exhausted. They figure they have about 5 gallons of water plus whatever one has in their canteens. Corey gets upset that Donlin is giving Hudak water, even though everyone kind of knows that Hudak is soon to be out the door. But Donlin says, it's their duty and it's their privilege to give the man a helping hand, even if they know he's going to expire. At least treat him with the dignity and respect that a person who was a member of their crew and a member of their, I guess, for lack of a better word, fraternity, that he deserves the same respect that anyone else would deserve if they were on Earth. So, of course, Corey doesn't like this, but he doesn't really like anything. He's sort of and I hate to say, one-dimensional character in the fact that he's the antithesis to everything good, whereas Donlin is more of the, let's look on the bright side of everything and try to make the best of the situation. And the other member of the crew that is still alive, or still at least functional at this point, is Pearson, who is somewhat the moral, or I guess you could say the middleman between everything. So, Hudak's going to die. Donlin assures them that this is home now, so they need to figure out how to survive in this new world. So they get the idea, Donlin gets the idea that when or if nightfall occurs, he will stay back at camp. The other 2 will go out in, different directions for a few miles to see if there's anything that they can find to help them survive in their new home, in their new environment. And after a number of hours, I think 6 is the magic number we're given, Pearson comes back alone. Corey comes back alone without Pearson. So, of course, Donlin asks Corey what happened. Corey says they split up to cover more ground. He came across Pearson's body. Pearson was dead. So he took the water from his canteen and came back to base to report. Donlin obviously doesn't really buy Corey's explanation, given the way Corey was acting the entire day before, and the fact that 2 men entered, one man left, so it was basically Thunderdome in the desert, and Pearson came out the loser. So against Corey's very strenuous objections, Donlin says, well, I guess we're going to go find our crewmate. So you're going to take me to where you found him. So he, at gunpoint, makes Corey take him another, several hours walk out into the desert to find their crewmate Pearson, wherever his body may be. So they go on a little trek through the desert, through the mountains, through the rocks, through the hills, so long that nighttime has now turned into day, and they are quite exhausted. But they get to a place, and Corey stops, and he says, well, here is where the body was. Here's where I found him. Surprise, surprise, the body is not where Corey says it was. So Donlin figures that Pearson must still be alive, and that Corey not only didn't really check on him, all he did was see his body lying there, steal stuff from him like his canteen and his water, and go back to base, basically preserving his own hide. So they search a while longer, and they find Pearson's body, and much to everyone's surprise, Pearson is in fact still alive. Very barely, but he's still alive long enough for Donlin to talk to him and, try to get some answers out of him, but Pearson's so far dehydrated and so far going and soon to be gone that he can't really speak or put into words what he's saying, and so in the sand, in the dirt, next to his body, he draws a symbol in the sand. And, of course, he's not able to articulate the words or get the words out as to what the symbol is or what the, what he is meaning to tell them. But Donlin kind of is able to suss it out that Pearson went up over the large ridge that lies before them, and whatever he was drawing was a picture of something he saw on the other side of that ridge. This is when the story takes a little bit of a turn. Mr. Corey decides to grab the gun that Donlin laid on the ground so he could tend to Pearson, and then proceeds to hold Donlin at gunpoint while Donlin is trying to go up to the ridge to see what was on the other side. They have a small argument where Corey says basically one man can live 5 days, or 2 men can live 5 days, or one man can live 10 days. And I like the one man living 10 days idea better than the 2 living 5. And he shoots and kills Donlin. So now the only surviving member of the crew is Navigator Corey, who is now, give or take, 6 miles away from his water source, unless, of course, what he has in his canteen or what Donlin has in his canteen. So just to see what Pearson was talking about, he decides to travel up onto the ridge to see what he was saying. And in this instance, we get a solid, several shots of Corey walking up through the hills, up on the ridge, while Rod Serling narrates. And he gets to the top, and he sees what Pearson was trying to tell him. As he gets to the top of the ridge, he looks and he sees that there are telephone poles leading down to, basically going over a road which has a billboard on it talking about a gas station and place to eat, and that Reno, Nevada is a scant 97 miles away. So Corey figures out that Pearson was actually drawing telephone wires with telephone poles in the sand, trying to tell them that just over the ridge is proof that they actually never left Earth. They just crash landed into the desert outside of Reno, Nevada, which if you've ever been to the desert outside of Reno, Nevada, it might as well be an asteroid. So, the episode then ends with Corey realizing what he has done, realizing that they'd never left Earth, and the entire time they were here, and that's why no one was looking for them and no one was contacting them. Although that really doesn't make a difference either way, because if they lost contact, they lost contact. Doesn't matter if they're in Reno, Nevada or on Pluto. It's still the same. If they don't have contact, they don't have contact. So the twist, the what a twist of an ending, happens to be that they are still actually on Earth. They never actually left Earth. They went up into orbit and crashed down into the desert. Mission Control lost them, couldn't find them. And even if they actually did leave the atmosphere and land on an asteroid, Donlin makes mention that, you know, the ship they were on was the only one of its kind, and it took 4.5 years to build. And so if they were stuck, they were stuck for at least, give or take, another 4 to 4.5 years. Which doesn't make sense, straight from a government redundancy that we seem to have in our country, where if we're going to build one rocket, we're going to build 2 rockets, because we always like to have a backup plan. And it's a good thing to have. So the whole they only built 1 rocket, yeah, that doesn't make sense. Because you got to remember also at this time, this was before we actually sent anyone into space. At this point, we were still just sending our groping fingers up out into the atmosphere to see what was happening. And so, if you will, this is basically a moralistic tale set in the space age, if you will. So, moving on from that, the episode ends, and we move on from there. And now, here I am, in the absence of Mr. Will Lastly, doing the closing narration. So, take it away, me. Practical joke, perpetrated by Mother Nature in a combination of improbable events. Practical joke wearing the trappings of a nightmare, of terror, of desperation. Small, human drama played out in a desert 97 miles from Reno, Nevada, USA. Continent of North America, the Earth, and of course, the Twilight Zone. Now, the episode was directed, as I said before, by Stuart Rosenberg, Stuart Rosenberg was born in 1927, and he passed away in 2007. So, decent life. He has 48 directing credits on his IMDb, which are just different shows, but then he did multiple episodes of different shows, so it's not like he only directed 48 things. But some of the things he did direct were, definitely nothing to sneeze at. He directed several episodes of Rawhide, The Defenders, Naked City, a couple of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and he also directed the movies The Drowning Pool, The Verdict, and Cool Hand Luke, which, if you've never seen really any 3 of those movies, they're all phenomenal. They all star Paul Newman, oddly enough. But I haven't seen The Drowning Pool in many, 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 many moons. But I have seen The Verdict, and I have seen Cool Hand Luke, and I can tell you that both of those are fantastic pieces of cinema. If you have the opportunity, I highly recommend watching both of them. Cool Hand Luke, to me, it's one of the best movies ever made. Certainly in that genre, in that era, everything. And Paul Newman is phenomenal in it. So if you like Paul Newman, if you like that sort of thing, if you like, competent actors and good scripts with awesome supporting casts, that's a movie you should watch. And the same with The Verdict. Very similar. So Dewey Martin played Corey, the surviving member. He was born in 1923 and he passed away in 2018. Sort of a bit player, sort of a character actor. He only had 50 IMDb credits on his, to his name, including episodes of Mission Impossible, Mannix, Hawaii Five-0, The Outer Limits, and he also had a small part in the movie The Thing from Another World, which, if you know anything about sci-fi cinema, The Thing from Another World is the movie that John Carpenter based his movie The Thing, starring Kurt Russell, upon. So, both are awesome movies. If you get the chance to look at either one, The Thing from Another World or The Thing by John Carpenter, either one, great sci-fi horror movies. Wonderful, nice things to watch on a quiet Sunday evening if you've got nothing else to do. You should give it a look. Very well done. All right. He basically worked sporadically up until the 80s when we basically never heard from him again. Next in the cast is Edward Binns, who played Donlin. Now, he was born in 1916 and lived until 1990, when he had a heart attack while being driven back to his home in his car, had a massive heart attack and died. He has 182 credits on his IMDb, and he is a well-known character actor who appeared in a couple of big movies, 12 Angry Men, Patton, and North by Northwest. So if you haven't seen any of those movies, all fantastic. Patton, if you're a war buff, it's a great movie. 12 Angry Men, still considered to this day one of the best character studies of people in cinema that has ever been, put on film. And North by Northwest, of course, if you know anything about Alfred Hitchcock, if you like anything done by Alfred Hitchcock, it's the top 5 of things he's done. And of course, Cary Grant is in it, who is, well, literally phenomenal in pretty much everything he did. Edward Binns was also in a lot of television shows, again, as a character actor. He was in MASH, The Equalizer, and Alice. He also, throughout his career, did a lot of voiceover work for commercials, including Amtrak and some other things. And as I said, he died in 1990, being driven back to his home of a massive heart attack in his car. And rounding out the cast is Ted Otis, who played Pearson. We know very little about Dewey Martin. We know even less about this guy. He was born in 1936, and as of last call, was still alive. He has 13 credits to his IMDb, including this episode of The Twilight Zone, a few episodes of The Rifleman, Maverick, and One Step Beyond. Beyond his acting career, nothing is ever really written about him, so I'm assuming he had a nice career outside of Hollywood, and he retired nicely and is living the good life, and we wish the best for him. Now, in trivia for this episode, this is one of only 4 episodes, which we actually heard one already in Time Enough at Last. But this is one of 4 episodes where Rod Serling does some narration in the middle. Mostly it seems to just add a couple of minutes time to the runtime of the episode, sort of as a stopgap or a filler, to make time on the episode. Now, in Mission Control, in the control room, you will see set pieces that, much like the spaceship from Third from the Sun and several other things you'll see throughout the series. Some of the set pieces in the control room were recycled from the movie The Forbidden Planet. Now, as I said before, some listings credit Alan Smithee as the director of this episode. This episode was, in fact, directed by Stuart Rosenberg, and the name Alan Smithee is usually a pseudonym for it's a name directors like to put on projects that they're not proud of, or they did only for the paycheck and it turned out to be schlocky and stupid, and they didn't want their name associated with it, so they didn't put their name on it, so they used the name Alan Smithee, which of course this episode and this television series, not schlocky, not stupid, and certainly this is by nowhere near the worst episode of The Twilight Zone ever made. As a matter of fact, this one is solid middle top. It's not a great episode, but it's not the worst either. It's a solid middle Twilight Zone episode. So there's no reason why anyone would want to be embarrassed to have put their name on this production. So that doesn't make sense. The title was almost used as the title to the episode The Gift, which we will get to eventually, which also that episode was considered for the pilot to be the pilot episode of this series, but it was later made into Where Is Everybody, or I should say it was later switched to Where Is Everybody, which turned out to be the pilot episode and the first episode of The Twilight Zone. Now, in 1969, there was a comic book piece that was sort of an adaptation of this story in 1969, where astronauts land on a very unforgiving planet and come to find out that they are, instead of running out of water, and that they are slowly suffocating because they don't believe the air outside of their spacesuits is breathable and livable, so they are basically on a run against time with how much air they have left in their spacesuits instead of how much water they have to survive. Incidentally, the water to survive thing, this episode will basically, you'll see it again in an episode titled The Rip Van Winkle Caper, which we'll get to eventually, and you'll see what I mean by this story and that story are very similar in scope and story, etc. But you'll see that as we come to it. Now, the twist of the episode where they were actually on Earth the whole time was I hate to use the word recycled, but it was also adapted. We'll say adapted. It was adapted for basically the twist ending of the movie Planet of the Apes, which Rod Serling wrote several adaptations or several screenplays, early drafts of screenplays for that movie, and is still, I believe, credited as a writer of that screenplay of that movie. So, at the end of the Planet of the Apes, spoiler alert, they're on Earth because they find the Statue of Liberty in the sand. Very similar to this, Corey finds the telephone poles, etc., etc. And then the last bit of trivia is one it's somewhat debated as to not that it actually happened, but the way it happened and what the actual payoff was. One story goes that Rod Serling met a woman named Madeline Champion at a party in Hollywood, and she came up to him and was chatting with him and said, "Hey, I have an idea for your new program. What if three dudes crash land on Earth, but they don't know it's Earth, and they think it's an asteroid?" And so one version says he paid her $500 on the spot for the idea, and another one was that he had met her someplace else, and she told him that idea, and he paid her another undisclosed amount of money, or some stories even have him buying her a brand new refrigerator for her home as payment for the idea for the episode. But either way, this is the only episode that was written by what could basically be labeled as a fan idea, or a fan suggestion. So either way, good on Miss Champion for that idea. It's a great idea. And well done, Mr. Serling, for coming up with this idea and putting it to film and, doing that again. And, of course, shooting in the Twilight Zone's favorite place, Death Valley, USA, which they also shot the previous episode, The Lonely, which was about a man named Corey who was stranded on an asteroid as a prisoner, and gets a robot as a present to kind of keep him company, and he winds up falling in love with her. Listen to my previous podcast episode about that episode. Great story, great episode. Also shot in Death Valley. So then, of course, they also had overheating problems and that sort of thing on this episode. Not as bad as they did on that episode, but Death Valley is a very unforgiving place, and you don't mess around in a place like that. And certainly they knew better from the first time, so it wasn't that much of an inconvenience on this time around. Now, for the goofs, all the men that agree that they must be on an asteroid, no one would ever, if you were an astronaut, if you were trained in any sort of space travel, apparently, and I didn't know this, but apparently asteroids, since they aren't big enough to have any sort of, atmosphere, then they couldn't support any sort of gravity or support any sort of life on that rock, and so there would be no vegetation, and they wouldn't have survived because they would have been on an asteroid. So again, vegetation wouldn't grow on an asteroid. Along with the scientific knowledge that they would have, they would also know that if they landed on something that is orbiting the sun, and the sun is basically the same size as it is, and they have air to breathe, and that there would be no reason to suspect that they were anywhere other than on Earth. So the whole premise kind of goes out the window scientifically, if you think about it in that sort of way, which them being trained scientists and astronauts should have thought about it that way, and then just kind of figured out where they were and started walking towards civilization, or at least a highway, and then they would have been saved. But that wouldn't have been very much of a Twilight Zone episode, now would it? The highway signs are wrong to be Nevada highway signs. Nevada highway signs have a crude sort of outline of the state on them, even at that time. While Death Valley is a very unforgiving place where they were shooting, Reno, Nevada is actually located between rivers and wetlands, so any sort of walking for a number of hours in any direction, and they would have been able to find water, and they would have been able to live and sustain themselves until they realized, oh, we're on Earth, and we can just hitchhike to Reno and get back to, mission control and to civilization. And that does it for the goofs section of the episode. So let's move on to likes and dislikes. I like this episode. It wasn't a great episode, but it was by no means bottom of the barrel in reference to Twilight Zone. Even the man Rod Serling himself said that this series is full of a number of turkeys, as he calls them. Certainly this is not one of them. Is it a masterpiece in cinema? It is not. But it was directed well. Death Valley is always an awesome place to shoot, and it always gives that desolation that is needed, to support the idea of helplessness and despair. And overall, it was a good story. Madeline Champion definitely came up with a great story for the episode, and thankfully she has been noted as such. It's a great idea for a great episode, and that's awesome. Dislikes, the acting by pretty much everyone except Edward Binns, who plays Donlin. It wasn't stellar. Great for TV, but it wasn't the worst I've ever seen. But we're not talking about Sir Laurence Olivier. You know what I mean? It just wasn't great acting. And like some episodes of The Twilight Zone, it sort of tends to drag in the middle. And then, of course, you've got that sort of 75% mark of the episode where we have Corey walking around in the desert while Rod Serling is narrating, sort of just to kill time and pad the runtime to make the appropriate 24 minutes and 30 seconds or whatever the runtime of the episodes happened to be at the time. So it fell a little flat from the 50% mark to about the 80% mark in the episode. So let's move on to casting for today. So if Hollywood, the entity, called me up and said, "Hey, Bill, we're redoing the Twilight Zone episodes, and we want your opinion on who you would cast for this episode if we were to remake it today." And here is what I would do if I were casting this episode today. For Donlin, I would go with Billy Bob Thornton, because not too many people can play exasperated and despair, but still keep an air of control in a situation, quite like Billy Bob Thornton can. And he's actually a really good actor. A lot of people down him, and you know, there was that whole thing for years with him and Angelina Jolie where they were, you know, out weirding the world. But the man is a very, very competent and very accomplished actor, and he's great at what he does. And that would be sort of I think a great role for him. For Corey, the person that is everything sucks and we're all going to die and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that you guys die before I do, I would switch it up slightly, and I would make that character into the character of a woman, just to mainly, if nothing else, play against the archetype that that women are the caretakers and the nurturers and the caring members of any sort of society or crew. And I would make her the character a her, and I would make her very very self-centered, very selfish, very egomaniacal, very nasty, as Mr. Corey is. And I would have that person played by Karen Gillian, or Jillian, I don't know how you say it. She was Ruby Roundhouse in the Jumanji films, if you watched those, with The Rock. She's got that sort of look to her that can turn mean in a second. While she's also very funny comedically, I think she could do good in that role very well. And for the character of Pearson, I would go with Colin Hanks, only because if you saw season 1 of the TV show Fargo, you know that Colin Hanks and Billy Bob Thornton work well together, even though they weren't on screen together for, you know, hardly anything, but it works well together. Colin is actually a very good actor, like his father, and he's got that sort of boyish youngness to him that the character of Pearson sort of had. He was the youngest sort of of the ones that survived, and I think that would be fantastic to put him on there in that character. Now, let's move on to, lastly, and certainly leastly in this episode, the moral or philosophy of the story. This is one of those age-old stories of, and even as Rod Serling puts it, and I can't remember which episode, I want to say it's The Shelter, for a civilization to survive, it must remain civil. And I think this is the one of the ultimate depictions of that. These people are in a terrible situation, and if they would have worked together, if they would have done what they were supposed to, and by that I mean, you know, Corey basically being the catalyst of change in everything. Had he went along with the program, they would have survived, and this wouldn't have been a Twilight Zone episode. It would have been well suited for, you know, a different program. But here we are. So the moral, basically, I think, is that in order for us to survive, in order for us to make it as a species, we have to work together, people. I mean, there's just no other way around it. We can fight, and we can argue, and we can worry, and we can kill each other off to try to better ourselves one more rung on the ladder. But in the end, someone's just going to come by and do that to us unless we stop the pattern, unless we stop the cycle. And the only way to do that is to get everyone on board in working together. And that's the only way we're going to survive, I think, as a species. Other than that, we're just going to be status quo circling the drain, maybe. As George Carlin used to say, we're basically circling the drain at this point. And he may be right. But we can always stop that if we have enough people to affect the change that is needed. Not to get on any sort of moralistic or philosophical high horse, just going off this episode, that we all have to work together to survive. It's the age-old thing that started from the beginning of man, the beginning of time, to now. For us to live, we have to work together, and for a civilization to continue, it must remain civilized. Good words by Mr. Serling. Good words by Mr. Serling, and certainly something to think about and something to live by as you go on about your daily life throughout the rest of the week. And I hope you have a good rest of the week. Now, the clock on the wall is telling me that it's time to go, but if you enjoyed this podcast, if you enjoyed this episode, if you enjoyed any previous episode, please leave me a note, drop me an email. You can reach me at Dimensions, that's DIMENSIONS TZ podcast PODCAST @gmail.com, and let me know what you think. Let me know what you think of any previous episodes, any future episodes, anything you want to see, anything you want to hear, any ideas you have, suggestions. Let me know. I'm open to your feedback. So with that, we will close it out for the evening, but stay tuned for next week's episode, where a woman goes for a drive and sees a bum on the side of the road. So stay tuned for next week's episode, The Hitchhiker. So have a good night, everyone. Be safe.